Alright guys, BLM here, back with a new video. In this video, we'll be continuing on my Survivor What If series. In this installment, we'll kind of be doing part 1 of a 2-part idea of videos I want to do here. So in this video, we'll essentially be talking about what if the Minority Alliance wasn't Pagonged. Now, obviously, I'm using the term Pagonged kind of loosely here. This doesn't necessarily mean that every single group of people that we're going to be talking about was fully demolished by the end game. It more so means that this is a group that at least started to get picked off in the early merge section of the game. Now, I will also be doing a sequel to this video at some point down the road where instead of the minority alliances that we'll be talking about, we'll be talking about the majority alliances that didn't end up sticking together. So that's another video idea that I want to do down the road. Well, in this video, we'll be talking about the seasons in chronological order. Let's start off with an iconic one here from Survivor Borneo. And we'll talk about the tribe that coined the term Pagonging. We're talking about Pagong. Here we're going to be talking about the 5 members that did make it to the merge. So we have Gretchen, Greg, Jervis, Jenna, and Colleen. I think first up, I think it's pretty clear that Jervis was kind of on the outsides of that group by the time that they merged. We see that he was left out on the Joel vote. And we do also see it looking pretty clear that the women had been working together by the time of that round. So I do think the first vote after the merge, I do feel like Jervis probably is the first one voted out of that group, probably unanimously. Obviously, Greg can mess with some things because that's usually what Greg does, but I do feel like the 3 women do work together to take out Jervis there. After that, it's a bit trickier because we do still have that 3-woman group and we have Greg. However, Greg was obviously very close to Colleen. I wouldn't be surprised if Colleen went out of her way to try to save Greg at that point. I would assume that they would be targeting Jenna, but again, that is under the assumption that Colleen does care enough about Greg to try to keep him at that point, because that's definitely not a guarantee. I think inherently Greg probably goes home at that point, as Gretchen and Jenna seem to be pretty close at that point. So again, it all comes down to Colleen, and considering that this was a point in Survivor where they didn't really have a clear tiebreaker, I feel like more than likely Colleen flips to vote out Greg before one of Jenna or Gretchen flip on each other. So I do think more than likely Greg goes home at the final 4. And that leads us to a final 3 of Gretchen, Jenna, and Colleen. Or again, I feel like Gretchen and Jenna are probably the core of that group. Again, it could go either way. I mean, Colleen and Jenna could be the core. Gretchen and Jenna could be the core. Gretchen and Colleen could be the core for all I know. I really don't have a great sense of how that final 3 plays out. But I do feel like out of the 3, Gretchen probably has the best chance of winning at the end. I feel like she's the type of person that would have the most respect from the jury at the end. I feel like Colleen is second. I feel like Jenna is probably last, the person that was probably the least liked out of that group. So I feel like that's probably the ranking there of who's most likely to win. Gretchen, Colleen, and then Jenna. Now moving on to the Australian Outback, where again we have another pretty clear minority group here, in that being the Kuchas. And this is a scenario I've talked about a good chunk already. Now, obviously there's 2 ways to approach this, the with Michael Skupin approach or the without Michael Skupin approach. As obviously Skupin falling in the fire greatly affected the game, and I think gives us a more clear-cut way that the game was going to end over the other option. But let's talk about the option where Skupin isn't there. So we do have Varner, Alicia, Roger, Elizabeth, and Nick. Now, this is the thing, is that I think based on what they've said before the merge, the plan was to vote out Nick at the next tribal that they went to. And I do think if they had done that, that really opens up this end game massively. However, the ideal strategic move, especially from Varner and Alicia, is to pick up Nick and vote out the other side. Now the question is, do they do that or not? I don't know. It doesn't seem like Varner and Alicia were really thinking about that before the merge. Now, obviously, this would have been later down the road, very late in the game, and by then they might have picked up on that and actually executed on that, in which they probably end up winning the game because of that. Essentially, the way that the Kucha tribe plays out is whichever of these 2 duos ends up getting the numbers at the very end is the duo that is more likely going to win the game. I do think Nick is inherently closer to Varner and Alicia than he is to Roger and Elizabeth. So if that had been the final 5, I do feel like that would have been the move to make. You probably vote out, I guess, Roger in that situation. To be honest, it doesn't really matter. And based on like the current point that we're at in Survivor history, I do think they vote out the other one in 4th place. I don't think that's the optimal move, obviously. I think the optimal move is to vote out Nick in 4th and then go to the end with the other side of the duo, who's probably easier to beat in an immunity challenge, and then pretty much all but guarantee that you're getting to the end. But I don't feel like that's the way that they thought about the game, especially back in Survivor Australia and Outback. But either way, I do think Jeff and Alicia would have been in the best position to get to the very end. The question is who wins? I would guess Varner. I would guess Varner would have the respect from the jury at that point. Now, Alicia did get some respect from the fact that she is a physical specimen, the fact that she is so good at the physical elements of the game. However, she's also someone that got into arguments with people, and I think also didn't rub some people the right way. So I do think Varner probably has the edge in terms of a jury vote there. However, in the other scenario where Michael Skupin stays in the game, that kind of changes the game a lot, because I think at that point, Varner and Alicia would have been 100% secure to vote out Nick first, and through that would have gotten to a final 5 where Michael Skupin now becomes the swing vote. And I think Varner and Alicia would have incorrectly thought that they had Skupin on their side, and through that would have probably been voted out immediately afterwards, allowing Skupin, Elizabeth, and Roger to get to the final 3, where if Skupin wins final immunity, I do think he takes Roger. However, if Roger or Elizabeth win final immunity, I think they take each other. Now, who wins in those scenarios? I think Roger beats Skupin, probably. I don't think it's a guarantee, but I do think that's more than likely the case, especially because there were definitely many points within the season that Skupin was looked at as a joke. Though that obviously, if he ends up winning a whole bunch of immunity challenges and stuff like that, I think that perception could change. Roger against Elizabeth, I also think Roger more than likely wins that scenario. However, I do feel like Roger's also going to try to give up his game for Elizabeth, which he did on the actual season. And through that, I do think Elizabeth could win just because Roger tells them to vote for Elizabeth. But I think inherently, based on the level of respect that the players seem to have for each other, I do feel like Roger probably pulls out that jury vote. Next up from Survivor Africa, here we're going to be talking about the Samburu tribe, plus Kelly, I guess? Why not? Now, I debated over whether or not this should be included on my sequel video, because technically this group could have been the majority at the final 9. However, Samburu was technically the minority alliance coming into the merge, so I decided to just keep them in this video. So first up here, if we're including Brandon in this, Brandon's the very clear first boot, right? I think Brandon gets voted out unanimously from that group. He actively did betray that group at the final 9. I think he was very much on the outs, especially at that point in the game. And then after that, I think the core 3 in Frank, T-Bird, and Kim Powers go and vote out Kelly Goldsmith, again, the person that wasn't on their original tribe to begin with. I think that's a very easy vote there. And then I think we're in a position where Frank and T-Bird are the power couple at the final 3. I think Kim Powers needs immunity. If she doesn't win it, I think the other 2 take each other. If Kim Powers does win it, I think she takes T-Bird to the end. And I think T-Bird wins in all these scenarios. I think T-Bird was someone that had the respect from the jury, was well liked out there, and also I think has a serious argument for playing the best game, and definitely does play the best game in this situation. So I think it's a very clear T-Bird win in this scenario. Now for Survivor Marquesas, and this was another tribe that I debated on whether or not to include in this video or the sequel video, but since this group did end up being Pagonged just 1 round after the merge, I decided to include them in this video, and that is the Road to 4. First, Zoe gets voted out first. I think she was very clearly on the outs of that group. Very easy. The question is what happens at the final 3. And I think this is a situation where Tammy is in the power position. I think she's the closest to the general. She's the closest to John Carroll. I think both of them take Tammy to the end. Question is, who does Tammy take to the end? To be honest, I don't think it really matters, because I do think Tammy wins every jury scenario here. I think Tammy was the most respected person out there. I think John Carroll definitely had some people not super happy with him, to the point where they wouldn't have voted for him and would have given the win to Tammy. While I think against the general, I think Tammy just generally is more liked than the general. So I think Tammy's in the best position here. I just don't know who she takes to the end, but at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter. Now for Survivor Thailand, here we're going to be talking about the Sukjai tribe. Now this is kind of weird because we only had 3 people at the time of the merge. So I guess we're going to be talking about them. We have Ken, Penny, and Jake. And this is a situation where I think Ken and Jake take each other to the end. They were very close out there from the very beginning. The question is, who does Penny take to the end? I don't know. I guess I would say she takes Ken. It seems to me that her and Ken were closer than her and Jake. But again, that's not really a guaranteed thing at all. Question is, who wins the jury vote? I think Ken wins the jury vote against everybody, I think. This is obviously right after 9/11. Ken was a New York police officer. I think you kind of got to give him the vote, especially at this point in Survivor history where we're not really thinking too much about the strategic elements of the game. I feel like Ken is someone that just inherently has the respect. to win a jury vote. Now, out of Penny and Jake, I think Jake probably has more respect than Penny in terms of a jury vote as well. Now, there were some people that didn't like Jake out there. I mean, namely Clay was kind of annoyed at Jake, but I do think overall, I think Jake gets the votes of the jury if he's against Penny. Now, the next few seasons didn't really have very clear-cut groups that end up being Pagonged. Both of them were very dynamic games, so for the Amazon, there's not really a point in talking about anyone at all. I mean, there's the Butch, Dave, Roger group, but it's really not that interesting to talk about. I think Butch is in the best position there, but Dave probably wins if he gets to the end. I think that's the scenario there. Of the Pearl Islands, despite there being a really dynamic game, I do feel like there's at least a group there to talk about, and we are going to be talking about the Morgan tribe. Now, the Morgan tribe, there were 4 people coming into the merge. There was Savage, Rhino, Dara, and Tijuana, and to be honest, I don't really know how this plays out. Now, obviously, Savage was looked at and revered as the leader, and he was very closely aligned to Rhino, while Dara and Tijuana were very close out there as well. The question is, how much of that sticks when they come to a vote at the final 4? Are they going to vote out Savage because he is a threat? Or are Savage and Rhino going to stick together and try to split up the women? I don't know. If I were to guess, I would say Savage and Rhino stick together for that first vote and probably go for Dara, I believe. I believe Dara was technically on the bottom. I think Dara probably goes, and then in terms of the final jury vote, I don't know who wins. Again, I think this is a situation where it's Savage is probably the most respected in terms of him being the leader of the group, but he also irritated a lot of people while out there. While Rhino is someone that was well-liked from the majority of the people out there, but also just didn't have the clout of being the leader that Savage has. Then I think we have Tijuana, who was another person that was very well-liked out there, very social person while out there, but also just could be looked at as a follower for a lot of the game. At this current point in Survivor history, I do feel like they would give the win to Savage. However, I do think there's a serious argument for Rhino. I feel like Tijuana is probably the person that has the least chance of winning out of these 3. Though coming into that final round, I feel like it should be Rhino in the best position, considering I think they both would know that Savage is a pretty big jury threat, and then also Savage and Rhino being very close. So I do think Rhino is in the best position there, and I think he is more than likely the winner. Now for Survivor All-Stars, again, kind of a small group to really run through, but we do have the Mogo Mogos. Only 3 people made to the merge. We have Kathy, Sheehan, and Lex. Kathy's in the best position. Both people take her to the end. And I think Kathy probably beats both of her opponents. I think against Lex, I feel like Lex pissed off a lot of people and also just wasn't just generally as likable as Kathy. And against Sheehan, I think Sheehan was looked at as Kathy's follower. And I think both opponents for her would have been very easy beats at the very end. Now for Survivor Vanuatu, we have the Lopevi tribe, the men at the merge. Now obviously it didn't get straight up Pagonged because obviously Chris ended up getting to the end and winning the game, but we're still going to be talking about this group. And to be honest, I think it still ends up with the Chris win. Because I think first up, I think Rory was very clearly at the bottom of this group. I think he goes first, 3-1. And I think Chris is the best positioned out of the 3. I think Sarge is 100% closer to Chris than to Chad. And I think Chad was closer to Chris. So I think both take Chris to the end. Chris probably takes, I think he takes Sarge, right? I feel like there's no way you can take Chad to the end with the story of him being an amputee. So I feel like Chris makes it to the end no matter what, and I feel like he probably wins a jury vote no matter what either. Again, I think this is another situation similar to the Savage versus Rhino, where, again, Sarge was technically the leader, but Chris was just more well-liked overall, and I do think Chris wins the jury vote in this situation. Now, there's really nothing to talk about with Palau, because obviously Oolong got oolonged. But with Guatemala, we will talk about the New Yaksha tribe, the tribe that came into the merge down in numbers. There were only 4 of them left. There was Gary, Bobby John, Danny, and Brandon. Now, first up, I think it's very clear Gary was on the bottom. He was the only person from the other original tribe on that tribe. I think Gary goes first. And then we get to a final 3 with Bobby John, Danny, and Brandon. And I think Danny and Brandon are taking each other to the end. They were very closely aligned. They had a final 2 deal. And I think Bobby John probably takes Danny to the end. That's the sense that I get. I mean, Danny was someone that, from what I understand, was in control of the swap tribe, both strategically in the sense that we see that being executed in the Blake vote. It's Danny and Bobby John that flipped their votes there, but also position-wise, she was just in the best position. So I do think Danny is in the best position to get to the end of the game. The question is, does she win? Now, against Bobby John, I feel pretty confident in the fact that she does win. Again, there was a very anti-returnee sentiment out there, so I do think Danny gets the jury votes for that. And also, I think just generally she played a better game. While against Brandon, I think it's a lot tougher. I do think Danny was very good at making relationships that would make her respected by the end of the game, but I also feel like Brandon was probably a better player than a lot of people give him credit for, and I think if he was given the time to remain in the game and probably end up winning a lot of challenges by the time he gets to the end of the game, I think he could gather the respect to win a jury vote as well. But based off of what we know from the season, what we've seen, I do think Danny has the leg up on Brandon. Now from Survivor Panama, we will be talking about the new Lamina tribe, the 4-person group that made it to the merge. Again, technically not Pagonged, at least not Pagonged in a row where Terry does survive all the way to the final 3, but here we have Nick, Austin, Sally, and Terry. And again, this is easy. The first round, I think Sally goes home. She was not part of that core group. Sally was supposed to come before the merge, but she gets saved by the other tribe. So I think here Sally gets taken out, and that leaves us with Nick, Austin, and Terry, where I think Nick and Austin are taking each other to the end. Terry probably takes Austin to the end. I don't know. To be honest, it doesn't really matter because I think Terry beats both of them at the end anyway. However, with Austin and Nick at the end, I think Austin probably wins. It's tough because I think Austin was definitely the most strategically savvy of the two, was the one that was more outwardly strategic of the two. But at the same time, I just feel like Nick is just such a playable option where he really does nothing and he's kind of boring, but because of that, there's nothing to really vote against either. But I do think at the end of the day, I think Austin is probably the better option of the two. Now for Cook Islands, and again, this is another one that I debated on whether or not to include it in the next video, but again, because this group did break apart right away, right after merge, we're just going to include them here. Again, that next video that I'm going to do, where I talk about the majority alliances, that will be more so groups that broke up in the middle of the merge, more so than at the very, very beginning. So here we're going to be talking about the new Rarotonga tribe, where at the merge, there were 5 of them. There was Penner, Nate, Adam, Candace, and Parvati. First up, I think it's easy. Penner is the first one out, very much on the outs. Just didn't really blend with that group. I think he's very easily the first one out there, followed by Nate. And that leaves us with an all-white person final 3, which was very clearly the outcome that they were trying to avoid. But here we would have Adam, Candace, and Parvati. And again, this was the first final 3 in Survivor history, so we're going to stick it at a final 3. And through that, I think Parvati wins. I think Parvati easily wins this jury vote. I think Candace is probably the most disliked of the 3. I find it tough to believe that she gets any votes, while I feel like the majority of the people out there just straight up vote for Parvati, which is kind of ironic considering most people consider Cook Islands obviously one of her worst games, and in reality, it's she was very close to winning Cook Islands. If her group had gotten the majority after the merge, I do feel like she is the best position to actually win that season. Now for Survivor Fiji, we're going to be talking about the new Ravu tribe, which is essentially the 4 horsemen. The 4 members of this tribe to make it to the merge. We got Edgardo, we got Alex, we got Mookie, and we got Dreams. Now first up, Dreams gets voted out. I mean, that's pretty easy. He was very clearly the person on the outs of that foursome. And that leaves us with the final 3 of Alex, Mookie, and Edgardo, where I would guess that Alex probably wins. Again, this is another situation. Again, this comes up a lot, where we have one person in Alex who is definitely the strategic mastermind of the group, the person that was looked at as the smartest person within that group. But then again, we also have Edgardo, someone that was looked at as very likable within the game and someone that no one really had an issue with, as opposed to Alex. So I think it really comes down to whether or not the jury is going to respect the strategic gameplay or vote based on personal bonds. Now, I still lean towards Alex getting the win. I feel like there were enough people out there that had respect for Alex, people like a Yao and an Earl and a Stacy and some of these other people that I do feel like Alex probably ends up winning, but definitely not a guarantee. Now for Survivor China, we're going to be talking about the Zanhu tribe, which, I mean, really is only PG, Eric, and Jamie. I mean, we can add Frosty in there, but I feel like he's the very clear first boot of that group. So in this final 3, I don't know who wins. I think it's either Eric or PG. I think Jamie was looked at as a joke for a lot of the time. And this is, again, another kind of similar situation where Eric is looked at as the nice guy, while PG is probably looked at as the more scrappy player here, though she did also get into some arguments. So I think there's people who wouldn't vote for PG due to that. However, if I were to just take a guess, I feel like they would give PG the win, at least certain people. Again, I think you have Jean Robert, who I think is someone that I think probably leans PG in this situation. I think Todd probably leans PG. I think Amanda by the end of the game probably leans PG. And I think through that probably comes Courtney as well, when both of her closest allies are also voting for PG. Like, again, that's enough for PG to win. Those 4 votes there. So I would guess that PG wins, but it's definitely not a guarantee. Now for Micronesia, there isn't much to talk about here. I mean, I guess it's really only just Eliza and Jason, and through that, again, Eliza wins. Whatever, let's move on. So we got Gabon. Gabon, we do have a tribe to talk about here. We got the Coda tribe. Now again, this is assuming that Marcus has already been voted out. I think if Marcus hadn't been voted out, I think he gets to the end and wins. But this is assuming how the tribe was coming to the merge. So we have 5 people here. We have Sugar, Bob, Corinne, Randy, and Charlie. Now, first up, I think Sugar is the first one voted out there. She was the only one not in the Onion Alliance. She gets voted out. I think then they vote out Bob. Again, they clearly say this in confessional that they've replaced Bob with Randy. So I do think Bob gets voted out there, and that leaves us in a final 3 of Corinne, Charlie, and Randy. And I think Charlie wins this jury vote, right? I think Charlie was definitely the most playable option of the 3. I think both Corinne and Randy pissed off certain members of the jury, while Charlie just didn't. And I think Charlie easily gets the votes of some of those people like a Sugar, people like a Susie, people like a Crystal, while also still probably getting Marcus's vote as well. Now, I think Corinne probably gets Bob's vote. I think Randy probably gets Maddie's vote and possibly Kenny's. But at the end of the day, I do think Charlie has enough to win there. Now, I'm just going to kind of skip over both Tocantins and Samoa because I feel like both of those seasons don't have minority alliances that were Pagonged. Like, both of them had massive majority alliances that were taken down by the small minority. And through that, both of those tribes will be talked about in my sequel video. But here for heroes versus villains, we do have to talk about the heroes tribe. And I think the first round's pretty interesting. I think inherently, I think Candace is in danger. I think Candace was the first one to be taken out had they gone to another tribal. However, I think Colby is also another option. And I also feel like JT could have been blindsided here, potentially. Now, to blindside JT, they would have needed both Amanda and Candace and also one of Rupert or Colby. And I just don't know if they can get the numbers there, but I think they could have tried for it. But I think at the end of the day, I think the most reasonable option here to go home is probably Candace, followed by Colby, which leads us to a JT, Amanda, and Rupert final 3. And I do think the winner is between JT and Amanda. I don't think Rupert's getting the votes to win this. And this is tough because I think you have JT as someone who played a very deceivious game on this season and was someone that had just won. So I do think there would have been some hesitancy on allowing this guy to win again, like immediately after he just won. Well, I do feel like Amanda is probably a more playable option as a whole, though she probably wouldn't get the vote of someone like a Parvati. I think Amanda probably already has people like a Courtney, possibly a Sandra on her side, while JT probably has Coach and potentially Colby on his side. Candace is probably leaning Amanda. Don't know where Russell goes. Danielle could go either way. Like, there is a lot of wonkiness here. I think just based on who's the more playable option to most of the jury, I would say Amanda is more likely to win. But I definitely feel like JT would have a really good shot here as well. Now for Survivor Nicaragua, where there isn't really a minority alliance to talk about. I mean, I guess we can talk about the Marty group, but that group didn't really end up being Pagonged. Again, this was a very wonky merge, but let's just talk about that group anyway. I mean, it was 4 people. We have Marty, Benry, Fabio, and Dan. I mean, I guess we can add Sash if we really want to because he was supposed to be in the alliance. But to be honest, I think Sash is probably one of the first people to go anyway. And then I think probably Marty is next to go. I don't know. I think it's tough because I think Marty and Dan were very close, and Dan and Benry were very close. And I think that could have been a solid 3 to vote out Fabio. But at the same time, I also feel like Marty would just be so blatantly the biggest threat at that point that they could have voted for Marty as well. I think if Marty gets to the end, I do feel like he wins. Like, obviously, he's someone that did piss off a lot of people along the way, but I do feel like he's also someone that would have the respect from the jury by the end of the game. But I think if Marty doesn't get there at the end, between Benry, Fabio, and Dan, I think it's close between Benry and Fabio. I think Benry would have some supporters, like people like a Chase, and through that probably the Holly and Jane side of things. While I do feel like Fabio would have the support of obviously Purple Kelly, Nayanka, probably Marty. But at the end of the day, I do think Benry probably has the advantage in a jury vote there, though not by much. Now for Redemption Island, we can talk about the Zapatera group, and there were 5 Zapateras that made it to the merge. We got Mike, Steve, Ralph, Julie, and David. Now, I think Ralph and David were on the outs. I think the core of that group was Mike and Steve, with Julie as a third. Ralph had been blindsided at the previous vote where Sarita gets taken out over David. So I do think Ralph and David are the next two boots. It doesn't really matter the order. And we get to a final three with Mike, Steve, and Julie. I think Mike wins the jury vote here. Again, he was a war veteran. He was someone that was very well respected for his physical prowess in the game, but also he seemed to be the most strategically savvy of the Zapateras. So I do think he's the one that probably gets the respect at the end, though I think Steve is a strong contender as well. I think both of them were actually pretty underrated players in the grand scheme of Survivor, and I do think both of them would have had a shot, but I do feel like Mike was the person that irritated people less. And I feel like Mike is the person that was looked at as the leader of Zapatera, and because I do think he probably gets the votes at the end. Next up for South Pacific, we do have to talk about the Savaii tribe, and this one's relatively easy to break down. First of all, I think Ozzy goes home first. I think he was someone that was already on the outs coming into the merge, so I wouldn't be surprised if he gets voted out there. However, to follow that, I feel like Jim Rice essentially dictates the game, where he's in the middle of two pairs. He's in the middle of Cochran and Don and Keith and Whitney, and I think he decides who gets to the end. I do think he sides with Cochran and Don, as he feels like that is the option that would give him the best chance of winning the game. And I do think if he gets to the end, I do think he has a really, really good shot of winning the game. I do think Cochran also has a shot, though. I think Cochran would have the potential to get the votes of the former Rupolus, but I do think at the end of the day, Jim Rice probably ends up winning the game there pretty handily. Now for Survivor One World, we actually have two groups to be talking about here. We have two versions of the Monono tribe. We have the original Monono tribe, the men that were Pagonged, but we also have the new Monono tribe that was also initially looked at as the minority group. So we'll talk about both of them. First up, talking about the original Monono tribe, so the men. There were 6 men at the merge. I think first up, Mike goes home. Mike was looked at as a massive outsider there, so I think he goes home. And then we're left with Troyzan, Jay, Jonas, Tarzan, and Leaf. And I think Troyzan and Jay are definitely the strongest pair within the game. And the question is, do the other 3 gang up against them? I would say not, because the other pair includes Leaf and Tarzan, so I mean, it's not looking good. So I think they probably take out Jonas first as the biggest threat, and then they get to the end with either Tarzan or Leaf. It really doesn't matter. I don't think either of them gets votes at the end. And in the final 3 of Troyzan versus Jay, I don't really know who wins. I would guess Jay. I think this is, again, another situation where Jay is the more likable, playable option, while Troyzan is probably the more strategic option, the bigger player. I think at this point, Survivor, especially with the jury that we got here, I feel like they would have respected Jay's gameplay over Troyzan, especially because Troyzan did really irritate some people from a real personal level, and so many people were just really, really close to Jay. So I do think they would have given the win to Jay there. But now for new Monono tribe. So here we have Christina, Alicia, Jonas, Tarzan, and Leaf. And with this group, I mean, the men have the majority, the Jonas, Tarzan, and Leaf contingent. The problem is that Jonas and Tarzan started to fight at the early portions of the merge. So I don't know if that continues on and they split off from each other and Tarzan goes with Alicia and Christina to vote out Jonas and Leaf, or if Jonas holds control and in that position probably ends up winning the game. Like if it's a Jonas, Tarzan, Leaf final 3, Jonas easily wins that final 3. However, if Tarzan flips, it probably becomes a Tarzan, Alicia, and Christina final 3, where I guess Alicia wins the game, though even that's up in the air. So, I mean, it's a big question mark. I would say Jonas is probably in the best position inherently to win the game, but I definitely think there's a scenario where Alicia does. Now for Survivor Philippines, and I mean, this isn't really a group to talk about, but we'll talk about it anyway. We got the Cowbells that we can talk about. I mean, this is kind of a weird scenario because, again, the Cowbell group, or at least the remnants of it, eventually did flip the game to take control of the game. But here we'll be talking about the original Cowbells, so Penner, Carter, and Jeff, plus also Denise, who joined later, and plus also Malcolm, who were a group at the final 10 round and then ended up losing Jeff and eventually gained back control. But if that group had made it farther into the game, I mean, I think Jeff is in the best spot, right? Because I think Malcolm and Denise are massive outsiders there, but also people that are big threats. So obviously Malcolm is probably the first one of that group to go as a really big threat. Question is, do they get rid of Denise or do they get rid of Penner? I think they go for Penner. I think they take out Penner, and through that, the final 3 is Jeff, Carter, and Denise, where I feel like Jeff Kent probably wins the game in that scenario. I mean, Denise definitely has a shot, there's a serious argument for her, but I feel like Jeff was someone that just had more respect from his other players while out there, that I do feel like Jeff probably wins. Now for Karamoan, where again, there isn't really a group to talk about here, but I guess we can talk about the group that did vote in the minority on that first round, which was essentially the remnants of the fans minus Sherry, plus also Malcolm and Corinne. And if this group had gotten to the end, I do think this group was pretty dysfunctional to the point where Malcolm and Corinne probably would have picked up Michael and through that voted out Reynold and Eddie. Probably got to the end together, unless Michael probably flips to try to get rid of Malcolm at some point, because I'm pretty sure he's a savvy enough player to know that he should have. But if Malcolm does get to the end, I do think Malcolm wins a jury vote. However, if Michael does end up taking out Malcolm, I think the final three probably becomes Malcolm, Eddie, and Corinne. I guess it would actually depend on a fire-making challenge. Whatever, it gets very convoluted at that point. But I do feel like Michael Snow was probably the most liked out of the fans and probably the one that would have the easiest time winning a jury vote. Now for Blood vs. Water, there's not much to really talk about here. I mean, Aris did have that alliance that did end up in the minority right away, but if that alliance had gotten to the end, Katie probably just gives up, to be honest. I don't think she even tries at Final Four. And we have Aris, Vetus, and Tina at the end, where I guess they could vote for Vetus as an anti-winner option, but I do think Aris had the most respect overall within the game at that point, so it could be either one of those two. I don't feel like Tina wins against those other two options. Now for Cagayan, here we're going to be talking about the new Apari tribe, essentially the group that had the majority coming into the merge but then lost it because Cass flipped. Now again, I debate over whether or not to include this in my next video, but again, because it was a group that fell apart right at the merge, I decided to include it here. So first up from this group, I think the person in the best spot in this group was Spencer. Spencer had two different groups going. He had the old brains in him, Tasha, and Cass, while also he built a new alliance with Jeremiah and Sarah. So I think through that, I think the first person to go is Morgan as the only person not in these groups. Then Spencer has to take a side, and I don't know which side he goes to, considering I do feel like the Jeremiah and Sarah side would have been a much tougher side to beat. I feel like Sarah was someone that was very well respected within the game. But then again, you also have Tasha on the other side, which was someone that was very well respected. So I think his ideal scenario would have been going against Cass and Jeremiah. In that scenario, I think he probably wins the jury vote pretty handily. Against Sarah, again, like there's people that really did respect Sarah out there. I mean, you got the Trish, the Tonys, the Woos out there. While Tasha there, you also, again, she was someone that was pretty well respected, though to be fair, there were also some people that did not like Tasha either. So I would say Spencer's best bet is to first probably go after Sarah and then flip back to try to take out Tasha if he can, though it's probably not the end of the world if Jeremiah goes, because I do think Spencer probably still wins against Tasha as well. Now we can talk about San Juan del Sur, and there isn't really a minority alliance here to talk about, or at least a minority tribe. We can talk about the Josh alliance that did end up in the minority after that first round. So here we have Josh, Reed, Alec, Wes, and Keith. Now obviously there are two duos here of Josh and Reed, and Wes and Keith, and Alex in the middle. I do feel like Alex sides with Wes and Keith, and more than likely that is the final three from this point, though realistically, I mean, Josh and Reed probably set themselves up better. But if that had been the final three, I think Keith probably wins that jury vote. I think Keith was, I guess, the person that had the most respect. I mean, to be honest, that's a very dark final three. It's like, how did we come to this? But it's like, I do feel like Keith is the person there that has the most respect from the jury as a whole. Now for Worlds Apart, I mean, there isn't really much to talk about here. I mean, the group that was in the minority coming to the merge was the no-callers plus Shireen. They just vote out Shireen. They get to the end as the no-callers. Here we have Haley, Joe, and Jen, and Joe probably wins a jury vote almost unanimously. It's like anyone voting for anyone but Joe, which again is kind of weird considering obviously the current opinion of Joe, but and at the time, on Worlds Apart, he was really well loved, and he was also someone that had a lot of respect from the other players in the game. So I think Joe easily wins a jury vote there. Now for Cambodia, and again, there's not really a group to talk about here because this was such a flip-floppy merge. I mean, there was the Witch's Coven plus also Cass, I guess. So the Wentworth, Abby, Cass, Sierra group that was in the minority coming to the merge, but that's a pretty tough group to really play out, as I think it's Cass and Sierra versus Wentworth and Abby. So really it comes down probably to a fire-making challenge, and then even then in the final three, I really just don't know who wins. It's very tough to assess who has the respect from the jury in that scenario, especially considering that group was like barely even a group. So really, there's not really much to talk about here. Let's move on to Kaoh Rong, where here, again, I debated on how to approach this. Initially, I was going to talk about that Scott, Ty, Jason contingent, but I kind of realized like, well, that's kind of part of the Braun Beauty alliance that came together around the time of the merge that broke apart, and that will be included in my future video. But for this video, I think we can talk about the Brains tribe on Kaoh Rong, who did technically come into the merge in the minority. So we have Neil, Aubrey, Joe, and Debbie, and I think this is again a fight between two pairs of Neil and Aubrey versus Joe and Debbie. However, I do think the most likely scenario here is that Neil and Aubrey go for Debbie. Aubrey goes to Joe and tells him, can you not vote for Debbie? Because he wasn't willing to vote for Debbie, but I do think he was also willing to let her go to a degree. So I think they would have caused a 2-1 vote where Debbie ends up going home. And through that, we get a final 3 of Neil versus Aubrey versus Joe, where I do feel like Neil has the most respect from that group. Again, Aubrey was someone that, despite playing the great game that she played on Kaoh Rong, she was someone that didn't have the respect from the jury to win the game. And I feel like Joe is someone that was looked at as a passenger for a lot of the game. So I do feel like Neil is the person that probably ends up winning that. Now for Millennials versus Gen X, again, very tough to really call a minority alliance on this season considering how flip-floppy the merge was, but there was the J alliance at the first vote that was in the minority. So we have Jay, Taylor, Will, and Michelle. And I do think Jay probably wins if that was the final 4, given the fact that he was the closest to each of those people. Now, obviously, they can technically gang up on him and vote him out, but I don't feel like that was super likely. Again, he was the closest to Will, he was the closest to Taylor, he was the closest to Michelle. Now, I do think Will is probably the most likely to turn on him, but I feel like that would just instigate him to turn on Will, and I feel like Will will probably be the person that gets voted out there. And through that, Jay probably gets to the end and probably wins a jury vote. Next up, we have Survivor Game Changers, and again, this is a very tough group to dissect. While the first vote ended up just being kind of a fight for pawns, I think we'll go and talk about the alliance that was formed in the second round and talk about the alliance that was on the outs of that. So we're going to talk about the people that didn't vote out Ozzy, essentially. So we have Ozzy, we have Andrea, we have Aubrey, we have Sari, we have Michaela, and we have Zeke. Now, first up, I mean, Zeke was on the outs anyway. They were planning on voting out Zeke at that tribal. So, I mean, Zeke probably goes home first, very clearly. Then at that point, it becomes a bit interesting because, like, we do know that Andrea and Aubrey were very, very close out there. And also, Ozzy was very close to Andrea. However, Ozzy also had a pretty decent relationship with Sari, while Sari had a very close relationship with Michaela. So, again, very interconnected group here. I feel like the most likely scenario in my eyes is I think Sari teams up with Michaela and tries to pull in Aubrey to blindside Ozzy. I feel like that's the most likely thing to happen here. And if she's able to pull that off, that puts her in a really good position moving forward, where I think Sari wins in any scenario at the end game. I think she wins against Michaela, Andrea, and Aubrey. However, she just needs to get there, and I do feel like she's in a tie situation at that point, as I do feel like Aubrey and Andrea were closer than Aubrey and Sari. But again, if Sari can just get there, I do feel like Sari ends up winning the game. However, if Sari does get taken out at the final 4 there, I feel like Andrea becomes the most likely to win a jury vote. Now for HHH, which is really the last like true pagonging in Survivor history, where the healers pretty much end up being pagonged. I mean, Mike does get saved for later, but he does eventually get taken out. But we will be talking about the healers here. So we got Jessica, we got Desi, we got Cole, we got Joe, and we got Mike. So first up, I think it is a split between two pairs. I think Mike's in the middle, and I think you got Joe and Desi on one side, and you got Cole and Jessica on the other side. I think Mike sides with Cole and Jessica, and if he does, he probably gets to the end with Cole and Jessica. And in that turn, I don't know who wins that jury vote. I would guess that Jessica would, considering Cole was annoying some people out there and Jessica was well liked and well respected. However, if Mike ends up going with the other side and goes to the end against Desi and Joe, I feel like that situation's a lot harder to read. I think Desi definitely has a really good chance of winning the game, but I also feel like Joe would have a lot of respect for the amount that he played the game, while also I feel like Mike would also have a non-zero chance in that scenario. So I think this could go all over the place. I think pretty much everybody on the tribe had a chance at winning the game. Next up, we got Ghost Island, and I mean, again, there isn't really a solid group to talk about here, but we can talk about the Malolos that did make the merge. So we do have Donathan, Laurel, Michael, Libby, and Jenna. Now, I do think Libby, Jenna, and Michael probably team up against Donathan and Laurel and get to the end, in which Michael ends up winning the jury vote. However, if they do decide to flip against Michael, which I think is pretty likely at some point, considering they all knew he was the biggest threat, I think it's more likely that they take Laurel to the end over Donathan, as Donathan was looked at as more as a jury threat as well. And through that, I don't know who wins a Laurel, Libby, Jenna final 3. I think Laurel would have some respect to get some votes, but I don't know if it's enough. Especially because Jenna was someone that was somewhat liked out there. Libby was someone that was, again, another playable option. I don't know who wins that. It's very much up in the air. Now for David versus Goliath, and I mean, there's not really a group to talk about here. I mean, the Davids come in on the bottom, but they end up essentially winning out in the numbers and essentially become a majority alliance, while the Goliaths were the majority alliance from the very beginning. So I think both of these groups I'll talk about in my future video. So we'll move on to Edge of Extinction, and here I guess we can talk about Lesu, the group of Rick, David, Wentworth, War Dog, and Lauren. Obviously, we saw how that first vote played out on the actual Lesu, and it will probably play out the same here. I think Rick Devens goes first, and then we follow that out with David. We get a Wentworth, War Dog, Lauren final 3, and in that, I think Wentworth inherently wins. I think War Dog has a chance. I think if he gets to explain every little thing he does, because he is someone that is a very strategic player, I do feel like he would have a chance, but I do think based on a natural perception of the game, Wentworth probably wins that. Next up for Island of the Idols, we can talk about the new Lyro tribe, who does end up being the minority on that first vote of the merge, except for Dean, who does flip over, but then again, I think Dean is the first one voted out from that group anyway. So the remaining players there are Jamal, Karishma, Kelly, Nora, and Janet, and I feel like Kelly, Janet, and Nora were the true core of that group. I think Jamal was someone that was kind of on the outskirts there to begin with. I feel like he probably been voted out, and then I think Karishma was obviously also on the outskirts as coming from the other tribe. So I do think the final 3 would have been Janet, Kelly, and Nora. Nora probably doesn't get any votes, leaving it to either a Janet or a Kelly win. I think Janet probably gets the votes of people like a Tommy, a Jack, probably a Karishma, but I do feel like Kelly does get the votes of people like a Jamal, Missy, an Aaron, Elizabeth. I think that contingent. I think Elaine's kind of up in the air, but I feel like she also probably gets the vote of Lauren. Like I do feel like Kelly seems like the person that gets the majority of the votes there. So I would say Kelly is the front runner there, but it could technically go either way. Now for Winners at War, and again, there isn't really like a really solid minority alliance here, but there was the Sele 2.0 that was Wendell, Nick, and Michelle that did become the minority right off the bat. And I do think that group, if they had gotten to the end, I guess Wendell probably wins. To be honest, it's really up in the air. I mean, there's so much game there that had been played that we would need to really figure out. But I think just based on perception, I do feel like Wendell is the person that would be looked at as the front runner out of that group. However, later in the game, there was another minority alliance that does eventually come together, and we can talk about that alliance too. Essentially, the alliance that ends up on the minority after the second Tyson boot. So we have Kim, Tyson, Jeremy, Denise, and Michelle. Now, I do think the core of that group is Kim, Tyson, and Denise. So I do think Jeremy and Michelle are the next to go, unless Kim or Tyson turn against each other. I think Kim or Tyson are the two most likely to win from that group. Where I think if Kim gets to the end without Tyson, Kim wins. If Tyson gets to the end without Kim, Tyson wins. I think if both are at the end, I think it becomes very interesting. I do think there would have been an anti-Edge of Extinction returnee sentiment that would have given Kim the edge, no pun intended, but it would have been very close in my opinion, because I think Tyson definitely has votes from the people on the edge, plus also possibly some people that got voted out afterwards. So I think it is up in the air, but I would give the edge to Kim. But there we go. I mean, that is most of the what if scenarios on what would have happened if the minority alliance had gotten to the end of the game. Now, obviously, as I said, I plan on doing a sequel video where essentially it is the majority alliance that maybe got split up along the way. What if that alliance had gotten to the end? So that'll probably end up being the next what if video that I end up doing. But for now, that's the video. Thank you for watching.